If you're anything like me, you've struggled for effectively your entire life to properly structure your studying and reading of books. Be it in the academic field or be it just for the sake of what you need to get done in your life, you have often struggled to come up with adequate structures, perhaps struggle to properly understand what books are telling you. Maybe you've fallen into the trap of relying entirely on audiobooks, and so you don't really develop a very good understanding. So I decided that I'm going to do a bit of a series, a collection of different videos on structuring your study habits properly, on how to read properly, and on how to memorize what you have read, and how to properly utilize it. This is going to be the first one where we're going to discuss how exactly to go about structuring your studying time. The first and probably most important thing to realize is that studying in a profane and curious way, without ordering it towards something practical, is actually a vice. It encourages pride. As St. Paul points out, knowledge puffeth up, but love edifieth. And so, the first thing that you have to do, if you're somebody who's involved in the internet to any great extent, is that you need to discipline the time that you use on the internet and make sure that you're only using it to explicitly productive ends. I used to have a vice where I would sit and play video games while listening to YouTube, and while I did learn a pretty decent amount this way, it wasn't focused study time. I got dribs and drabs and bits and bobs. It wasn't effective. But the moment that I dropped the video games and started reading books on paper with a pencil and taking notes and stuff like that, I immediately noticed that my retention in things that actually matter went up in comparison to audiobooks. Now, there's a fairly simple, at least in concept, solution to this, and that is to decide what you need to know. You have two precepts to follow: the love of God and the love of neighbour. You must acknowledge that, but you also must consider your own interest. You also have to consider your time as well, and your needs. A young father of 3 is going to need different things than a NEET is going to need. Now, how do you go about doing this? Well, one of the things that I did, which may or may not be preferable, is that I made 2 spider diagrams. One for the love of God, and one for the love of neighbour. And I filled these out with different categories of knowledge that I thought that I might need to fulfill these precepts. Right? So, under the love of God, I had things like my own state of spiritual failing. So this would be spiritual theology, studying liturgy and things like this, right? I had theology properly considered. I had philosophy to some extent, and things like catechesis. And if you were in a married situation, you would probably have something to do with your relationship with your wife and with your children, with the rest of your family, because they're all bound together. Although this would potentially come also under love of neighbour, it's kind of hard to strictly separate these things out. The second category that I had, the second one, as you can guess, is love of neighbour. And this would include things like looking at the needs of the general society and the people around me who aren't my family, and what they need in order to, continue their function, or to grow in virtue, or to live in a way that is better. So let me give you examples of things that I've gotten written on these 2 diagrams, just so that you can get an idea of what I'm going on about. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to show this on screen, because both of these are over 2 big A3 sheets in this art book. So I'm just going to give you an idea of the categories that I have for the love of God. So I have man himself considered, and this is things like anthropology, psychology, and just human interaction generally. Being effective in that, be it with people around me, as in family, or just people out on the street, right? I have stuff on the spiritual life, which governs work, which governs physical exercise, finances, mind, heart, and will. So this is generally what is connected to the precept which is found in the Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your might and all your soul. This is actually Christ's version, not the one that's said in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy lacks mind, I think. So I have that. Then I've got God's nature, and this links to things that you might expect from generic theology. This would be things like Christology, Trinitarian theology, the scriptures themselves, dogmatic theology, and sort of systematics, right? And then I have God's creation, which would be history, ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics, general philosophy, natural sciences, lives of saints, and miracles. So this is just stuff that I really need, like right here and right now, for my own needs generally, and also for the needs of people who might be in my family in the future. So I have work stuff down, so like programming languages I have to learn because I'm thinking of going into software engineering, but I might also go into security. Right? That's the example of love God, and then there's love of neighbor, which I've also added an addendum of things that people have problems with, generally speaking. So this would be the society at large I've based this on. So I have philosophical problems that I've perceived. So this would be things like the fetishization of science, that kind of thing, subjective morality. Basically, work centered on solving that kind of problem. Then I have economic and material problems. So this would be things like the growing gap between rich and poor, the overabundance of people graduating with degrees, problems like this noted down. I should probably also note that I've got these problems noted down, but I also have works written next to them where I can think of them. So, for example, on the previous one, I have, for example, on the Holy Spirit, right? I have De Spiritu Sancto by Saint Basil the Great, and I have the Letters to Serapion by Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, right? Those would be examples of, texts. You'd write texts alongside these. You won't necessarily know texts. In fact, this actually serves as a really good way of, researching things if you need to find certain problems. Then I have moral and psychological and social problems. So this is general problems in society with morality. So this would be, promiscuity, lack of control of passions, this sort of arrogance that you see. And then finally, you have religious and historical. So this is things like people being disconnected from their lineage and stuff like this. I think you get the idea. It's going to differ in your case, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to stab at. If you sit down and you plan out with, like spider diagrams or whatever organizational tool you want, and you decide what you need to know at the moment based on like a formal examination of conscience, an examination of what you actually know, not what you think you know, and based on what you think is going on out in the society, you can gain information and use what precious little time you have to study to grow your ability to love people out in that world. And then finally, for this video, what you want to do is find how long you can profitably study. Now, the average for this, from what I understand, is about 3 hours. But you might not be that case. For example, I have a friend of mine who can profitably study for 6 hours at least, if he manages his time correctly. I am a little less developed in that particular virtue. I can probably handle 3, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But I haven't properly pushed myself. But this is what you need to do, right? The average person can manage 3 hours. If you can't manage that long a day, just reduce it down. If you can go for longer, go up as practical matters and, your own nature dictate. You can find out when you've crossed this line, when you feel like you're engaging in busy work by doing the reading. Now, you should persist anyway, if you can, but if you're not retaining anything that you're reading, you're wasting your time. And you'll know this eventually after some time whacking your head against it. With particular texts or particular subjects, you should always monitor your progress with these things. You should have something like a diary or an exercise book where every night you're noting down precisely what you learned and your progress in that based on the previous day. So, for instance, you might be reading a book on Latin, and you're learning the words and you're going through the text trying to discern what words need to be known and what don't. So you might note down, oh, I learned X words from this text, and that would be sufficient to articulate progress. Sometimes it's going to be a lot more a lot more ambiguous as to your progress. So, for example, if you're trying to learn human behaviour by reading the works of Shakespeare, it may be more like something along the lines of, oh, I saw Malcolm do this in Macbeth, and therefore I learnt this about human behaviour. That might be another way of doing it. But if you're not making any appreciable progress after, say 2-3 weeks, you should drop the thing. Finally, and something that I want to emphasize, is that I think, at least in my case and the case of the particular friend I know who studies for 6 hours, it's kind of difficult to study the same thing over and over for hours on end and for weeks on end. So what you're going to want to do, unless you're really in the zone, is split down your study time into different things. So first of all, you don't get bored, and second of all, so you don't burn out on a particular kind of work. So for instance, you can program for an hour if you're that way inclined, and that uses a certain kind of work or skill in studying, right? But then you will still have room in another kind of work that might pertain to something like finding the themes in a history book regarding the relationship between certain characters, right? You want to keep a close eye on that and vary things out as much as you can. In fact, I think, if anything, as a final note, one of the biggest problems in modern society is that people over-obsess with a single subject and then just end up drilling into that and then judging their entire world based on that. Don't end up like that. So in the next part, we're going to talk about choosing books in themselves very effectively, because you have only 3 hours a day to spend on this. You don't want to be engaging in busy work with bogus books and with bad books. So we're going to talk a little bit about identifying what makes a good book and what doesn't. Thank you very much for watching.